感谢 Chef 称，谢谢这些观众朋友们对于我们的支持。明天同一时间，华尔街论坛与您再会。
欢迎来到六度解析，我们为您带来 FT 最新报道：蜜罐和影响力行动，中国间谍转向欧洲。布雷斯特是一个多雨的工业港口，受大西洋的冲击，是法国海军及其潜艇和威慑力量的所在地。近年来，这里也见证了大量中国女学生与在其海军基地工作的水手之间的婚礼。我们应该如何评价这样的关系？一位关心的议员在巴黎国民议会的闭门听证会上问法国核潜艇力量的负责人，蜜罐及代理人试图与他们的目标产生浪漫关系，是情色间谍惊悚小说的常见情节。他们也是中国间谍活动在欧洲扩展的标志，上周在一系列高调逮捕行动中达到了顶峰。3名德国公民因涉嫌试图向中国出售敏感的军事技术而被拘留。警方还突袭了德国极右派欧洲议会成员的一名工作人员，他被指控秘密为中国工作。与此同时，英国检方指控2名男子涉嫌为北京从事间谍活动，其中1人是议会研究员。尽管据报道，摩里奥·德利尔上将在2019年警告法国议员有关布雷斯特婚礼，但现任和前任情报官员表示，最近发生的事件更符合中国在欧洲的间谍活动的典型特征。特别是，正如一位官员所说，他们是北京精心播种操作的例子，耐心地寻求培养政治影响力，并塑造欧洲对中国的态度。随着欧洲决策者开始将中国以及与俄罗斯的战略关系视为安全威胁，而不仅仅是经济机会的来源，这对北京变得越来越重要。中国人正在做更多间谍活动，而西方情报部门正在变得更善于发现它。曾任英国外交情报机构俗称 MI6 运作主管的尼格尔·因克斯特表示，与美国相比，中国情报机构在欧洲的活动迄今为止较少。但随着欧洲对中国态度开始变硬，我们可以预期会看到更多的影响力行动。中国外交部上周对最新一轮间谍指控表示否认，这一指控是在德国总理奥拉夫·舒尔茨结束了对中国的为期3天的访问后不久爆出的。中国是德国最大的贸易伙伴，其意图是非常明显的，即抹黑和打压中国，破坏中欧合作的氛围。该部发言人表示，但中国国家安全部长陈一新在周一的《学习时报》上发表了对该国间谍机构的号召，称中国必须组织一场强有力的攻势。他要求其机构进行特别的反间谍行动，坚决挖出和消灭叛徒。西方情报机构和安全分析人员表示，中国的间谍活动，特别是由其民间间谍机构、国家安全部负责的活动，是真实存在的。更令人担忧的是，有迹象表明他们可能与已渗透到欧洲政治极端的俄罗斯网络相交汇。中国和俄罗斯有共同的目标，当这符合他们的利益时，他们会共同推动。两国都试图破坏西方国家的地位。芬兰安全情报局去年底警告说，创立于1983年的中国国家安全部是一个民间秘密。警服务被美国描述为联邦调查局和中央情报局的结合体，其覆盖范围遍布中国社会，负责反间谍和共产党政权的政治安全。他还被指控在海外进行广泛的间谍活动和影响力行动，以及窃取外国情报和技术。与其更为集中的西方对应机构不同，据西方官员称，国家安全部在一些竞争激烈的省级中心设立了一些间谍活动基地。上海分局通常负责美国的间谍活动，而浙江则倾向于专注于欧洲。近年来，在欧洲的一位中央国安部特工丹尼尔·Daniel Wu 曾促使比利时前参议员弗兰克·克雷尔曼 Frank Creelman 影响欧洲的讨论，涉及从中国对香港民主镇压到新疆维吾尔人的迫害等问题。据称，吴还是其他与俄罗斯有密切关系的极右派政治人士的中国联系人，其中包括担任莫斯科在乌克兰被占领地区的虚假公投的选举监督的角色。中国和俄罗斯都在执行相同的极权主义策略， 在对民主产生怀疑，并在任何挑战现有政治分裂的团体中获得影响力，通过缓慢的滴滴行动渗透其中。诺丁汉大学国际关系助理教授丹·洛马斯说，目的是制造不和谐。他补充说，俄罗斯和中国不是制造这些问题，他们是民主国家自己造成的。相反，方法是通过在极端主义团体中煽动支持来撕裂这些问题。中国在欧洲的间谍活动规模潜在巨大。据报道，2019年，欧盟外交服务警告说，在布鲁塞尔大约有250名已知的中国间谍，而俄罗斯特工则有200人。最近，英国议会情报与安全委员会去年底警告说，中国国家情报机构的规模几乎肯定是世界上最大的，拥有数十万名民间情报官员，这为我们的机构提出了覆盖的挑战。中国的人类情报收集是大量的，该委员会称。相比之下，根据最新可用的数据，英国的 MI6 和其国内对应机构 MI5 的员工总数约为9000人。此外，中国还进行着庞大的跨国网络行动。FBI 局长克里斯托弗·雷在1月份警告说，中国可能部署的黑客人数超过他自己机构的网络人员至少是50:1。情报官员和分析人士表示，欧洲对中国间谍活动增加关注的一个原因是俄罗斯入侵乌克兰。这扩大了机构的视野，自2001年以来，他们已经从国家主导的威胁转向了反恐。这也导致了更多跨机构合作。入侵的冲击导致了国家伙伴的合作，他们并不总是合作。一位西方官员说，结合数据可以创建更好的数据集，并允许进行更多的关联。中国的经济实力和地缘政治影响意味着欧洲对中国的政策将比对俄罗斯更为细致。关于中国是否代表安全威胁还是经济机遇，始终存在争论。洛马斯说，只要中国保持国际游戏规则的经济大国地位，这种争论就会继续。然而，这种辩论可能正在发生变化。去年底，意大利正式退出了中国的标志性“一带一路”基础设施倡议。上周，布鲁塞尔根据新的反外国补贴权利搜查了中国安全设备供应商诺杰克公司的办公室。与此同时，随着欧洲情报机构的更紧密合作，中国和俄罗斯的间谍网络可能会默许地采取同样的做法。中国内参通讯的出版商阿当尼表示，欧洲的极右派团体可能提供肥沃的土壤。尽管许多欧洲团体不会为外国间谍工作，但其中一些可能会愿意与莫斯科和北京合作。他们想效仿俄罗斯和中国模式的某些方面。你说，他们倾向于在越来越多的话题上与他们达成一致。华盛顿的詹姆斯敦基金会智库情报分析师菲利普·吉罗斯同意，并指出了特定的人物，例如列入克里姆林派赞助的瓦尔代俱乐部名单中，并在乌克兰受到制裁的捷克极右学者和政治人物拉迪斯拉夫·泽马内克 （Ladislav Zemanek）。泽马内克为总部位于布达佩斯的中国中东欧研究所撰写文章。该机构由总部位于北京的中国社会科学院欧洲研究所运营。该研究所的所长和中东欧部门负责人是冯中平，他是中国现代国际关系研究院的前高级人员。这是一个被西方学者认为是国家安全部门的一个思想库。正如吉罗斯最近所写的那样，随着中国和俄罗斯的继续对齐，个体合作者更有可能为这两个极权主义国家工作。随着极右运动变得越来越主流，以及主流政党变得越来越极右，中国共产党情报通过俄罗斯培养的网络影响欧洲政治的风险将继续上升。联系金融时报时，中国社会科学院的代表表示，中国中东欧研究所不从事政治活动，追求客观和独立的学术观点，并遵守匈牙利和欧盟的法律。他们表示，中国社会科学院与国家安全部或中国的统一战线社会影响活动无关。冯中平几年前就离开了中国现代国际关系研究院。他们表示，泽马内克只是偶尔的撰稿人。当《金融时报》询问泽马内克时，他表示，麦卡锡主义的精神已经复活，我们的基本权利受到了攻击。 他说，记者应该关注调查美国对欧洲的影响以及他们干涉我们事务的行为，而不是帮助美国人在国家之间制造分歧。欢迎来到6度解析。在最新一期与全球舆论领袖的未解之谜系列采访中，退役的高级上校周波与 Amber Wang 和 Sylvie Zhuang 进行了一次对话，涵盖了中国的军事、中美关系、现代战争以及塑造世界的冲突和紧张局势。周波是清华大学国际安全与战略中心的高级研究员，他在中国人民解放军度过了40年的时间，主要担任外交职务。中国和菲律宾在南中国海的有争议岛屿问题上已经存在一段时间的争端。您认为这种局势会持续下去？中国的策略是什么？中国从未对菲律宾使用过武力。中国与菲律宾有争端，并不意味着它与整个东盟有问题，无论菲律宾是其成员还是不是。南中国海问题不能解释为中国与东盟有争端，中国只与少数东盟成员国有争议。实际上，许多东盟成员国在有争议的水域之间存在重叠主张。关于你对中国在南中国海紧张局势中的角色，你有何看法？我不相信美国会为了任何东盟成员国而站出来对抗中国，他们不会那么愚蠢。他们在欧洲和中东已经有足够的麻烦了。中国从未威胁要对东盟国家使用武力。中国也遵守了2002年南海各方行为宣言的承诺，该宣言反对在该地区使用武力。我希望菲律宾不要太冒险，他们应该知道他们在与中国相比没有机会。中国一方的实力远远超过菲律宾，即使这种局势可能会持续一段时间，最终菲律宾政府还是必须让步。西方讨论中国时，不可避免地会批评中国人民解放军的挑衅行为，并担心中国军队的壮大。你对外界对中国人民解放军的看法是什么？中国人民解放军确实会引发不同的反应，例如敬畏、恐惧或不确定。中国海军现在是世界上最大的海军，因此人们自然会问，一个日益强大的中国人民解放军对中国和世界意味着什么？但也有人认为，自从1979年以来，中国人民解放军就没有打过一场战争，质疑中国人民解放军是否能够战斗。世界上所有军队都有一个共同的任务，保卫领土和主权。但由于中国是一个主要的全球大国，其军队有2项额外的任务，保护海外利益和承担国际责任。例如，自2009年以来，中国人民解放军一直在亚丁湾为中国和外国船只提供平等保护。这是一个很好的例子，说明一个强大的中国人民解放军如何将中国的国家利益与国际责任相结合。中国已经设定了将其庞大军事力量转变为现代化作战力量的目标，该目标定于2027年，即中国人民解放军成立100周年。这个目标具体意味着什么？中国人民解放军希望成为什么样的力量？中国人民解放军的最终目标并不是秘密。我们已经宣布，我们希望在2049年之前成为一支世界一流的军队。但这个目标实际上在2022年中国共产党第20次全国代表大会上进行了修改。该会议表示，我们应该加快实现这个目标。这意味着我们必须在2049年之前成为一支世界一流的军队，尽管它没有说明我们应该提前多少年实现这个目标。2027年的目标是另一回事，因为它标志着中国人民解放军成立100周年，这是一个里程碑时刻。我们希望建设我们的军队，并准备好实现我们的2049年的目标。同时，我们面临着一个最大的困境，那就是如何证明我们是一支世界一流的军队，而不必打赢一些艰难的战斗。中国与其他国家保持和平关系已经带来了巨大的好处，因此显然不能通过战争来测试剑的锋利度，那是错误的做法。虽然我们已经40多年没有打过战争，但这并不意味着我们不能打仗，否则美国军队就不需要对中国人民解放军感到如此担忧了。为什么中国希望加快建设军事？我认为这与你对整体形势的看法有很大关系。 即美中关系的紧张局势或台湾海峡和南中国海可能发生的冲突。台湾应该是最重要的因素。在台湾问题上，你可以看到北京对台湾前任领导人马英九和现任领导人蔡英文的态度不同。他的继任者赖清德可能会带来更多的不确定性。美国正在加剧与中国的竞争，并为台湾提供支持，尽管声称遵循一个中国政策。这些都是我们应该加快实现中国人民解放军目标的很好的理由。一些美国官员表示，中国的目标是在2027年准备好夺取台湾。你认为中国人民解放军的时间表与北京统一台湾的目标有关吗？如果你仔细研究中国所说的内容，它仍然是关于和平统一的。我们在中国共产党的第20次全国代表大会上提到，我们将对和平统一拥有最终耐心，并尽最大努力。目前来看，我认为情况基本上仍然是这样的。你认为台湾的当选总统赖清德是否可能突破北京的红线？北京已经把他称为一个麻烦制造者，以及一个顽固的台独活动分子。老实说，我不知道。我认为我们有很多理由说他是一个顽固的台独活动分子，因为他曾经宣称自己是为台湾独立而努力的务实工作者。但问题是，当一个人得到一个新的职位时，事情可能会改变。所以我们必须等待并观察他将会做什么。我相信美国也在密切关注。在美国众议院议长南希·佩洛西于2022年8月访问台湾之后，中国人民解放军进行了一系列演习，并似乎在台湾海峡上频繁飞越了分界线。你对这种情况有何看法？它有多危险？从历史上看，我们并没有像现在这样频繁地飞越分界线，至少不像现在这样频繁。事情在佩洛西的访问之后发生了变化。他访问台湾对我们来说是完全不能接受的。这种挑衅性行为重新确立了现状。如果他没有访问台湾，我们将很难在台湾周围进行为期4天的实弹演习。这种挑衅行为肯定会导致反应，反过来又会产生不可逆转的新现状。你现在看到我们更频繁地飞越分界线，这是对他们挑衅的回应。这也是一种新的现状。根据许多美国官员和智库的说法，针对台湾最有可能的军事选项是封锁，他们认为这种封锁可能会失败。你认为呢？军事规划者很少只依赖一种选择。我认为我们有不同的选择。我们的选择取决于实际发生的情况。从台湾移开，你对乌克兰战争有什么看法？没有战争会永远持续，问题是它将如何结束以及何时结束。我不相信乌克兰人能够收回失去的领土。如果俄罗斯不进一步扩张已经占领的地区，他们会很幸运，因为乌克兰去年发起的反攻全面失败了，尽管得到了西方的全面支持。乌克兰的军事平衡并不对乌克兰有利，整个西方没有足够的弹药可以提供无限量的支持。我不认为乌克兰会占上风，尤其是如果唐纳德·特朗普再次上台的话，他可能会对美国的乌克兰立场做出180度大转变。这是欧洲国家最担心的。我们只是不知道这场战争何时会结束，因为双方现在都没有停火的愿望。那么，你对中国在乌克兰战争中的立场有什么看法？这场战争对中国意义重大，甚至反映了中国在国际上的崛起地位，因为突然间，所有人都问你站在哪一边，你的想法是什么？这很有趣，因为这场战争与中国无关。为什么人们会问起中国呢？因为中国的态度太重要，不能忽视。西方认为中国可以简单地要求俄罗斯结束战争，但事情怎么会那么简单呢？看到一场与中国无关的战争如何实际上恶化了中国和欧盟之间的关系，这真是令人沮丧。但我不是悲观的。我认为只要乌克兰战争持续下去，中欧关系就不会太好，因为欧盟对中国的期望很高，北京无法满足。但只要台湾海峡没有战争，中欧关系就不会太糟糕，因为他们不必在美国和他们最大的贸易伙伴之间做出艰难的选择。
let's start by talking about your background. I kind of gave a little bit of a hint of it, but would love to hear more about it from your perspective. You can go back as far as you want. I understand you have part Taiwan, part Hong Kong heritage, which actually I myself have as well. Maybe you could start there.
Yeah, no, sounds good. So, I think one of the sort of interesting things about my background is it's a real blend of Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China background. And, each of these influences have shaped the way that I've developed in my career as well, personally and culturally. I have a living connection to historical events through my parents, World War II, the Chinese Civil War, and it sparked an interest in me pretty early on that I might want to go to work and live out in the region. Having grown up in suburban New Jersey for my whole life, I always wanted to live in the city and actually explore the world. And so, in college, I went to school in Philadelphia, in an urban environment. I studied finance initially, but I also, I was I was kind of a tech geek growing up, and I was one of those kids who was programming on their Apple II when they're 9 or 10 years old. And so I also was interested in technology. But actually the Asia connection was also another interest area of mine. And it's really interesting looking back when I think about how, macro events and external events sometimes shape your career. But, for me, it was probably the dot-com boom, because I was all set to head out to Silicon Valley in 2000. And I'd done a tech internship that summer, and then the bubble crashed. And so I made a pivot. And, not surprisingly for a lot of my classmates in my undergrad business school, investment banking was one of the well-trodden paths. And, I had this inclination to not want to go down the really well-trodden path. So for me, what made it a little bit different was exploring opportunities out in Asia. This was the winter of 2000. It was 2 to 3 years after the Asian financial crisis. And it wasn't a well-trodden path at that time to go out to Asia. And I just fortunately had an opportunity to, through some friends of mine, find some job opportunities out there, and eventually interviewed. And, that winter it really came down to working for a boutique tech investment bank in the States and going out to work for Deutsche Bank in Asia. And so I ended up choosing to go out to Asia. And so I spent 3 years out there. I met a lot of really interesting people. It was a really fascinating time to be out there. Our clients at the time were mainly, I was mainly focused on mergers and acquisitions, which in Asia at the time was working a lot with actually the state-owned enterprises in the oil and gas and power industries for not only for China, but for Japan and for Korea. And so it was a really fascinating journey for me, having grown up, in the States my whole life, to go out there and suddenly be sitting across the table from, CEOs that, from backgrounds that are completely different from yours, and just seeing how different things were. There was definitely a big culture shock and just a life shock for me.
Can I ask you a question about how so I've had similar experience, but I'm curious what your experience was like. So for you as what's called an ABC or someone who grew up primarily in the United States, but is, say, of Chinese heritage, when you were meeting with, real Chinese people, like someone who was leading a state-owned enterprise and had come up in maybe the communist system, taken the Gaokao and maybe attended, one of the major Chinese universities, what was that like? Like, was there an immediate affinity? Were there tensions? How did you get along with these folks?
Well, one, I was relatively junior at that time, so I think my direct interactions with the chairman or the CEO would be quite low. But I mean, I was even quite surprised at how much of a cultural gap there was with people in Hong Kong who could speak English. So for me, it was actually a just identity-wise, actually affirming how American I really was by seeing how Asian people out in Asia were and seeing how things were different. This was also, Steve, post 9/11, and it was actually a bit of a shock to see how the rest of the world thought about the sort of issues that are talked about in a certain way in the States, in the media, and seeing how they talk about in the South China Morning Post or in other, foreign publications. So that was a big shock for me as well, because you kind of grow up with a certain, impression. You recite you sing the national anthem, you sing America the Beautiful, and all of a sudden you see a different side of the world. So for me, I think just going out there was really, really eye-opening.
And so you were living in Hong Kong during this time, is that right? And
that's right. Yeah. So I ended up living 3 years out there. It's anybody who's done investment banking during the analyst year knows it's a grind. But it was definitely work hard, play hard, building a really interesting network. You're all sort of sitting in the trenches together at the same place in life. Most people are single. And so you end up developing a really, really nice network out there, which I think has grown up with me as I moved back to the States after 3 years. A lot of my network has either stayed in the region or actually, dispersed in other parts of the region, in Korea and Japan, mainland China, et cetera.
And I'm guessing if you traveled in China during that period and looked at Chinese companies, you saw a lot. I mean, you saw unfettered capitalism at work, maybe more capitalism than you could possibly appreciate, you could actually ever see in the United States or Western Europe.
Yeah, I remember I think it was December 1st, 2001, which was the first time I actually crossed the border into China. And, one of the things that first struck me was poverty. I just never seen that level of poverty before, coming out of the border, border control at Lowell, and seeing, beggars on the street. But at the same time, it was juxtaposed next to this, as you call it, this dynamism that was also very, very apparent. So, at that time, this was the time when Chinese SOEs, which are most of our clients, were really venturing out into the world. So in doing M&A for them, our value add, our role was to help them navigate this new world of foreign acquisitions. So, there were just really, really interesting stories that, I could talk about, but it was a lot of it just had to do with culture clash and not understanding how business is done abroad. And part of our role as bankers was to, guide them through this process.
Do you think you could contrast what the current level of complexity is or sophistication among Chinese companies now versus what you saw 20 years ago?
Yeah, 20 years ago, in the power sector, I would just dive into the power sector because we spent a lot of time there. This was early 2000s. Enron had just happened, but the late 90s and the early 2000s in the power sector was about deregulation. And actually, at that time, the Chinese were, there was a couple of things going on. The Chinese were very supply constrained on power. So there's a lot of power shortages going on. They just, they couldn't build power plants fast enough to meet rising demand. When they imported power equipment from abroad, it was expensive relative to their level of development. And so they were definitely constrained on the power side. And they're also very, very open to, Western style market reforms. They had been already experimenting with partial privatizations of some of the power companies, the power producers, like Huaneng or Datang in the 90s. And they were experimenting with true Western style power reform, including dividing the power grid into, transmission and distribution and breaking it up and privatizing the grid as well. So I think one of the things we noticed was that post Enron, some of they sort of, it was one of the first times where they kind of sat back and said, actually, maybe we shouldn't move so quickly on some of that regulation. And so Yeah, but this was still a time in general where I think there was a lot of openness, and there was a lot of, I would say, looking up to the West as a model for development. And I think that's sort of changed over time as the Chinese companies themselves have gotten more sophisticated and learned on their own, learned by doing, and kind of felt their way across that river of development.
One of the things I emphasize in my tweets or when I talk about human capital or the fertility problem in China is that people with experience with China back 20 years ago would realize that the average education level was very low. So a whole generation had basically kind of missed college because of the Cultural Revolution. And even for a kid graduating high school in around 2000, maybe only a few percent, maybe 6% at most would get to go to college. And so most people just didn't have that much education. And whereas now, of course, the college going rate is similar to the United States, and people are about twice as likely to do STEM subjects there as they are today. So I think if you didn't live through that, you wouldn't really appreciate drastic change in the average level of human capital for people that are young and entering the job market in China.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think you've seen this, explosion in sort of the college enrollment rates, starting really in the early 2000s, but really starting to ramp up in the 12 to 13 years ago. And today you're just seeing a net influx of, plus 10 to 11 million college graduates. And this includes vocational schools as well. But 10 to 11 million college or vocational level graduates entering the workforce. And one of the things I do talk about in some of my tweets is this theme of how structural change in China is actually underpinned by this demographic change. So this, when I was there, it was really about the blue collar workforce. You had the biggest generation, the biggest cohort was actually, I think, 1985 or 1986, and 95% or more of them never went to college. So they were effectively blue collar. And these are the folks that were really building the country and developing the country in the 2000s, first with the export oriented manufacturing boom, then post GFC, the switch over to property and infrastructure. And now as you have this rising and growing labor pool of college educated workers, now you're seeing, not surprisingly, the rise of companies like BYD, which are hiring tens of thousands of PhDs and masters and undergrad college graduates, and really switching their model from this old, construction and concrete intensive, asset intensive model into really an IP, technology, and manufacturing or advanced manufacturing model.
Yeah, you're hitting on, I think, one of the main conceptual things that people who are watching China from the West are missing. We should maybe put a bookmark there and come back to it, because I want to finish with your bio before we get in. That's a pretty meaty topic for us to discuss, this pivot from property and infrastructure driven economy to really advanced manufacturing and technology driven economy. Let's talk about how you got into went from investment banking to private equity and venture. How did that happen?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. I spent I think by the end of my second year, I was already feeling a little bit homesick, and I also started to realize, and this illustrates some of the shift that was going on in Asia at the time. When I joined as a 22-year-old analyst, the head of my group was an Australian expatriate who had done project finance throughout the region in the 90s. And, just if you think about, where investment banking, where the fees were going, it was going to China. And so, as I mentioned before, we're we have to pitch business, we have to win mandates and work with national, state-owned enterprises. And so we're dealing with Chinese people. And so you'd have this situation where, actually our role was to really draft the content of the documents, and we would actually send the documents. This is actually another interesting thing. We would send the documents up to our Beijing office, and our Beijing office were, graduates, the top graduates from the top universities in China like Beida and Tsinghua. And they were their job at the time was as glorified translators. They would take the sort of energy and power content that we had drafted in Hong Kong, and they would translate them, and then we would pitch, these mainland Chinese executives through a translator. And investment banking is a relationship business, and it was not tenable. So by the end of my second year, we actually ended up hiring a fairly young mainland Chinese director. I promoted him, and he was one of the first wave of mainland Chinese who had actually left China in the early 90s and gotten their finance training out in the West. In his case, it was at Rothschild's in London, and this was the archetype of the type of investment banker who had both the cultural affinity as well as the specific technical skill set to be able to win business. And we also hired a lot of other mainland Chinese executives from other banks, and we started building a real business out there. But to me, it sort of signaled a couple of things personally. One was, I kind of alluded to earlier, I felt like even in Hong Kong, it was not the perfect cultural fit. And when you started seeing where the banking industry was going, it was going towards mainland China. It was even bigger leap. And so, having grown up in the States, I had language skills, but, I didn't have a network. It would be a struggle to develop myself out there as sort of a mid-career, mid-level professional in the investment banking industry. The other reason, Steve, that I left was I was a little bit sick and tired of doing mostly oil and gas and power. I was a tech guy. And so I was like, okay, I want to sort of develop that aspect of me as well. So in 2004, I ended up moving back to New York, and I pursued that. I ended up getting a job with InvestCorp, which was it's a Bahrain-based private equity firm, and I joined the technology investments group over there, which was it was a good fit. It was a relatively large firm, but this was a unique. We had our own fund structure, and it was a relatively autonomous group within a larger, private equity firm, and we focused on technology, and it really started with late stage venture capital, and then we shifted more towards a control oriented private equity model, which I can talk about as well. But I think this was really interesting for me because I think when you're on what they call the sell side, which is investment banking, you're really advising other companies, and you have a little bit less at stake. I think what was wonderful about investing is that you got to put your money where your mouth is. So you have to be right. That's the most important thing. It's about being rational and being a rational investor. This was also the time where I started, starting to invest in the stock market, and I discovered Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger and Berkshire Hathaway, and just really gravitated towards their investing model, but really this theme of continuous lifelong learning, building. I think the late Munger called it the last work of mental models for investing in life, and that really dovetailed with the professional training I was getting at in the private equity industry, where you learn how to do due diligence, you learn how to build mental frameworks and investing frameworks, you deepen your exposure into multiple industries and sectors. Within the technology space, I started out looking at semiconductors and telecom equipment, and later moved on into enterprise software and digital marketing and security. But I think the real takeaway for me from this was this idea that to be a good investor, you really have to be rational, and you have to get things right, and that's the most important thing. I think this does touch on some of the things that we'll talk about later with China and try to figure out what's actually going on out there if your point is to get things right.
Yep. I knew Charlie Munger a little bit when he was still alive, and he had a connection to Caltech, and he liked to meet scientists. And so I attended a few dinners with him. He was already quite old, but still mentally sharp. And one of the things about him is I was like starstruck, when I met him, and I was like, wow, it's a great honor to meet you, Charlie. And he was like, no, Steve, the honor is all mine. And he was so humble. He really admired what the scientists did. And he used to just say like, hey, what Warren and I do is really just common sense. But, you know, of course, we all realize not very many people can do it. Actually, most people will deviate in some way from, even if they understand the principles that Buffett and Munger use, they can't really implement them. So just a really unusual guy, I think. Very smart. I mean, you know, he was self-deprecating, but fundamentally, I think he was actually very, very high G.
Yeah. If anything, like I'm more of a Munger than a Buffett fan. I just think his approach to, you know, learning and being multidisciplinary.
Yep.
And I think Buffett talked about him in his eulogy in his last letter about how much of an influence he had on building Berkshire Hathaway and really changing it from that sort of cigar butt, you know, buy something for $1 for 30 cents to really building value over the long term by compounding and by growing instead of just looking for deals.
Their view into China was largely influenced by an investor called Li Lu from Himalaya Capital. And some of the dinners I went to were at Li Lu's house. They all lived near, Munger and Li Lu lived kind of near the Caltech campus. And so I think Munger had a little bit more of like a visionary, was willing to be like a little bit of a visionary about the future, rather, I think much more so than Buffett. Yeah. So that experience as someone who actually invested in public companies or large companies that are almost public companies, I'm sure that also helped you when you eventually became a founder of a company. So maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things that, you know, one of the quotes that, you know, either Buffett or Munger, I think Buffett said was, you know, I'm a better investor because I'm a businessman and a better businessman because I'm an investor. I think that really resonated with me. So, you know, after 10 years or close to a decade, you know, working with InvestCorp in private equity, where I really just grew up, I joined as a, you know, associate. I went through then with the first fund, we raised a second fund, we raised a third fund, invested it. I had a decision to make, I think, where I wanted to take my career. And, you know, while I think investing allows you to dive into the next layer, especially private equity investing, because you're working very closely with company executives, you have an influence on, you know, trying to, you know, create value through active management and through operational change. You know, there's still a level deeper, you know, really becoming a businessman. And so in 2014, you know, we had finished investing, you know, our third fund. It was, you know, in very, very good shape. And I decided, and I had an opportunity to start a company with some of my friends, who were internet entrepreneurs. And we ended up building a business, and launching a business. It was just sort of opportune timing around the launch of the Affordable Care Act, / you know, Obamacare. So we built a business around healthcare.com domain that was really about making healthcare easier to understand and purchase for consumers, which was really this, you know, the view was that over the long term, you know, American healthcare, which is very much an employer-based system, was moving towards more of a consumer decision, and that would create roles and for companies that could help consumers learn about the very, very complex healthcare industry, and, you know, for a generation or for a country that frankly does not know how to buy health insurance. And I think it was it was part of this move deeper into understanding how to launch a business, how to raise money, how to build something from nothing. And, you know, subsequent to, you know, healthcare, I mean, my partners really grew that business over time. I actually ended up taking a sabbatical and going out to Taiwan, which was the first time I spent a lot of time in Taiwan in 2014 and 15. But since then, I've been really in this mode of, you know, investing and getting involved in projects that I invest in, you know, actively, or and I've been involved in companies, you know, from blockchain to ed tech to internet companies. So, and I have a few in the works right now.
Great. Hey, when we get off this podcast, I got to hit you up to see if there are any potential clients of superfocus.ai that you can intro me to. So probably some good customer support or other maybe HR related or healthcare related stuff that we can deploy our technology in.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's turn to, you're writing about China, the development of China. You've obviously been an observer of an analyst of developments there for some time. I'm actually reminded of a blog post I made a long time ago, some writing of Charlie Munger's, where I think he gave a talk somewhere, and he talked about how he liked economists, but he was a little bit disappointed in the limitations of where they would take their analysis. And very early on, he pointed out that there was this kind of problem that the U.S. was going to help China industrialize and advance technologically, but at the end of it, the U.S. might end up with a very formidable competitor, and it could end up being like a real problem for the United States. And he said he talked to many academic economists about this issue, and most of them would just not go beyond this issue of gains from trade, Ricardo and things like this. And he was very disappointed with that, and wrote a long talk actually, which I put on my blog a long time ago. And he was very insightful because what he predicted more or less came true.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think some of the issues with economists are maybe that they don't, maybe there's less of a multidisciplinary approach to,
Yep.
For them, it's a world of numbers and theories. And I think with China, it's just too big and too complicated to boil down to just a set of metrics, especially high level metrics.
Yeah, in the same way that I think you could be an economist and have some kind of very theoretical notions about how markets work and economies develop, but maybe you've never operated a business, so you lack a certain amount of common sense about how these things really go. In the same way, you have people who maybe see some numbers related to China, but maybe they don't speak the language. Maybe they have some slight ideological bias or cultural bias. And I just see people going, especially today, going way off the rails in terms of their perception of what's happening there or what will happen there in the next decade. Maybe you want to comment on that.
I mean, this goes back to the comment I made earlier, Steve, about how when I went out to Hong Kong, the world looks at things in a very different place. If you grew up in Hong Kong, if you grew up in Asia, you grew up in Thailand, I mean, your experience was completely different. And I think Americans sometimes take it for granted. They just assume, and this was especially like in the late 90s, sort of the post-communist, glow of that era. There's a bit of a triumphalism about the American way and how things should be. But not everybody thinks like that. And I already noticed it, just going out there and just being away from, being surrounded by the same, messages and sort of the same group think. And just seeing, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and seeing things a little bit differently. And so I would still obviously keep in, read articles. We had a Bloomberg terminal, and you'd read all these articles. And a lot of times I'd feel there is definitely this in, what I'm seeing, on the ground. And this was the early 2000s. And this was, I think, there's books about the collapse of China. And I think, the SOE restructuring in the 80s with a heavily indebted banking system and how that would lead to collapse. And I wasn't seeing it. I was seeing something different. So there's already a gap then. And I would say that it's just grown since then, because I think as China has caught up, I think before it was so far developmentally below the rich world, the OECD, the United States, that it was actually a very good partner. I mean, China had all this labor, they needed jobs, and, rich countries would, love to buy goods cheaper and keep inflation down. And so it was actually a really good, it was a really good relationship. But as China has gotten closer, we've seen the geopolitical tensions rise. I think that's added another element that has, if anything, just widened the gulf between understanding of China and, what's actually happening on the ground over there, at least between the mainstream media or the Western media and what I think is more of happening and more real on the ground.
I think, going back to the way Munger thought about it, or the way that he juxtaposed the economists' opinions of that era to himself, was that, okay, you have this Ricardian complementarity that you just mentioned, like, oh, we'll do the high-tech stuff in the States. We'll let these guys do the low-tech, ugly manufacturing stuff. It'll keep it, it's deflationary. It's great for American consumers. But what Munger said is, well, eventually they catch up and they're going to be competing at the high end. And how are you going to like them apples? And of course,
Right.
the ability to compete at the high end is also going to feed into their own defense industries and military capabilities. And also the fact they can now fund very large military expansion. So we've reached that era. Now, you would think that if I were a national security guy or a U.S. economist, and I was just trying to help, thinking only in the interests of my country, I would need to have a realistic view of what's happening over there in order to plan. Like, are these hypersonic missiles for real? Can they target them? Can they build batteries better than? Should we just give that up to them, or can we afford to give that up to them? But underneath all that, there has to be a level of deep understanding and realism. Otherwise, there's no limit to the amount of mistakes that our policy people can make. And it kills me every time I read Foreign Affairs or The Economist, or I just feel these people are just very, very strongly miscalibrated about what's happening in China.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent there was this belief that because of China just has a very different system, and there was almost sort of implicit in that it was a system that wouldn't scale, or it would eventually. I mean, I think people still thought about China as just a delayed Soviet Union back then, and that eventually it would, the inefficiencies of its system would catch up to it. And I think we still see that. I think there is this notion also that Chinese people could only copy, and that they couldn't, innovate. And so I think there's a lot of, I don't know if we should call it bias, or there was just some preconceived notions. And so I think we've been constantly surprised at how quickly they've developed as a result. That, actually in maybe the process of reverse engineering or copying, you actually develop underlying skill sets that actually take you forward. I think one of the first industries I saw that with, I mentioned earlier, we were investing in telecom equipment. So in the US, we invested in a soft switch company based in Texas. And so, at the meetings, we started talking about this little company out in China called Huawei. And I think you could already feel the sort of, I think that telecom was one of the first front lines of the national security concern. And you already felt back then, this was like in 2005, 2006, that they were already concerned about Huawei. But there's also this feeling of, well, they're just copying. They copied that Cisco code in 2003, and they're just not going to be able to catch up. And what we saw through the next 15 years was not only did they catch up, they actually, in 3G, they were late to 3G, so they were behind in 3G. They sort of caught up with 4G, and with 5G, they just, they've taken the lead. And so now it's happened with solar, it's happened with EV, with electric vehicles. It's potentially happening with chips. So, I think we're constantly surprised that they continue to, break through and innovate and develop. And it's not because of they were like, we weren't the reason. I mean, I think it was a beneficial relationship. It was a symbiotic relationship for a long time. But at the same time, it was also a lot of their own hard work and nuts and bolts, developing and getting educated and learning on the job and just learning by doing. And I think one of the things that I think, Americans need to understand is that Chinese policymakers have long just advocated taking on work because they realize that you actually learn through modern work. You learn on the job, you learn how to, be a citizen, you learn how to, you learn new skill sets. And those are spillover benefits to the what the economists might focus on, which is just the trade flows. There's actually the human capital aspect that's building up as an intangible asset that is significant, hard to measure, but significant. And that's actually what is probably the most important thing that drives, this long-term sustainable growth that we've seen.
Yeah, I don't want to knock economists too much, although as a hobby, I sort of do that. But not only do they generally not understand business, entrepreneurship, and innovation, they also don't really understand technology development. So these are all blind spots for them. For them, these are just like exogenous things in their models, or they don't really have, a deep appreciation of how they go. I think one of the contributions to the discourse on this comes from Elon, because Elon, he really was fighting uphill battle when he pointed out to people that, inventing the thing is 10 times easier than learning how to manufacture that thing efficiently at scale and at low cost. Those are two different things. And people always just assumed, oh, we'll invent stuff in America, and that other low value thing, which is figuring out how to manufacture it effectively and cheaply, we'll leave that to these Chinese guys, but that'll never be very valuable. Of course, it wasn't valuable for a long time because they were so desperate for work in China for a long time. They were willing to underprice all of that horrible stuff. But when they're no longer willing to do it for free or do it on the cheap or just to learn, suddenly you're going to realize, wait, that's the more important part maybe of the value chain, rather than the idea like, oh, what if I had a little phone that could fit in my hand? Like to turn that into an actual iPhone is really quite difficult. And Musk now realizes this. And I think my understanding is the Shanghai Gigafactory is probably the best of his Tesla manufacturing facilities. And the guy I've heard, I believe the guy who runs the Tesla Gigafactory, a Chinese guy, is really secretly the guy who runs the most important aspects of, the building part of Tesla.
Yeah, no, I think that sort of learning aspect of manufacturing is the part that we forgot about. And I think for a while it was okay because we had this mass of manufacturing knowledge in the United States, but manufacturing is a mentor apprentice business. And so when we ship those jobs out to China, we would teach the factory owners how to, we would send them molds. We teach them how to manufacture, and then they would take that knowledge and pass it down to their workers. But the link was broken in the U.S. We didn't have a next generation of young manufacturers that were learning, starting as entry level out of high school on the factory floor. And so after 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and this, by the way, didn't start with China. This started with Korea and Taiwan before. Yeah. After 30 to, that was really, I think, the major damage from the hollowing out of our economy was that the link in terms of manufacturing knowledge and learning was broken. And it's really, really hard to rebuild that from scratch again. And not to mention just the knowledge aspect, but just having these whole ecosystems of supply chains that really make manufacturing work, at scale and with efficiency. I mean, that all went over to Asia as well. So I think there's definitely a lot of, there's merit. I think we've realized that. I think as a country, we've realized that. I don't think at least from what I've said, I don't think we've quite figured out how to recapture that. I think companies like Tesla I think what you're alluding to is kind of this reverse knowledge flow back from the manufacturing expertise in Asia back to the States. But I don't see that necessarily happening at scale. I mean, even Tesla itself is having a hard time, getting political support in the United States. And actually what we should be doing is taking that knowledge that they actually have today and replicating it with in other sectors and in other manufacturing endeavors.
I think it's very hard to recover because you need to, not only have huge investment in the infrastructure to do advanced manufacturing again, but you need to valorize it. You need to get young people excited to do it. And that still doesn't really exist. Like if you ask high school kids what they want to do in America, very few of them think oh, I want to get into some factory and really learn how to use that CNC machine extremely efficiently and build really complicated shapes and stuff. How many kids are really thinking about that? So I still think no matter how much money the U.S. Congress appropriates to reinvigorate manufacturing in America, I still think we're lacking some key components that we need to really catch up to revitalize it here.
Yeah, no, I would agree.
So one of the things I've seen you tweet about is trying to make a more substantive comparison between, number one, the size of the U.S. economy versus the Chinese economy, but also things like GDP per capita, the meaningful income and wealth or standard of living that people have there versus here. All of these things are very complex to tease out. I don't know, maybe you could say a little bit about it for the audience.
Yeah, so I think that everybody often gravitates towards this comparison between China and the United States, and I think it's I approach this as sort of a compare and contrast. I think there are some basic ideas and concepts that where the United States and China are quite similar. Like we're both very large countries. I think large countries can act in a way that's differently from small countries. They can be more self-sufficient because you got to really think of it as a collection of 31 provinces or 50 states, each of them that could be the size of an average European country. So you really have to think about them as continent-sized economies. I think even culturally, I think Chinese and Americans are actually culturally quite similar. I think Chinese people are actually quite direct. And they're entrepreneurial. They're hustlers and they get things done. I think Americans as well take that approach. But I think there's also a lot of things that are different that that are hard that are important to understand because it drives a lot of the ways of handling the economy or things like policy. So just a few, for example, would be one is China is just suffers from the opposite problem as the United States. In the United States, we have all this land, all these resources, and not enough people. So for the last 300 years, it's been this constant immigration. We've been absorbing immigration and creating wealth through immigration because actually what we need are people. Whereas in China, I mean, they've always been the opposite. They've had too many people compared to the amount of resources on the ground, and that's why they were poor. And while this is quite obvious, I think people sometimes don't understand what sort of implications that has on things like economic policy and doing things differently. China has to do things differently. China can't, this goes again back to the sort of, Washington consensus or the triumphalism after in the 90s of there's one right way of doing things. And actually because of some of these differences, actually, no, you can't, Chinese people can't, live in houses with lawns and everybody can't have a car. I mean, it's just going to take away from, it's just not possible. So I think that's something that again is obvious, but people sometimes don't quite link it to their analysis. The other thing is just this level of economic development. Obviously, China was poor for a long time. I think very few Americans understand the level of poverty that Chinese people understand within their lifetime. And that has a major cultural effect. It also has an effect on how, people think about consumption and investing. Really the last generation to really experience the kind of poverty that China had in the 80s and 90s was the greatest generation during the Depression. And so I think sometimes, we know that China was poor, but we haven't quite, there's not a visceral understanding of what that poverty means and how it might change the way that your policies develop.
Two specific implications of that fact that people there in living memory can remember being very poor. And, even just 20 years ago, when I were traveling in China, we could see unbelievable levels of poverty, which, largely are gone now. Anybody who lived through that is, number one, maybe not going to have the same kinds of expectations about the level of their retirement, right? So these old people in China, they're probably just happy, in my experience, happy just to be around their family, eat a good meal, play checkers with their friends. They're not thinking that good retirement means they get to go on a cruise ship, around the Gulf of Mexico. Or they don't think that way. So So I think while there are, like, when you look at the specific numbers of like the demographic challenges that China faces, like how are they going to support these older people? I think the expectations of these older people are much lower than people who had grown up in a developed economy their whole lives and now we're about to retire. These are people who grew up in poverty and then now are getting ready to retire. So I think that's something Westerners can't really appreciate. The other one is that the idea that if China hits a rough patch, the government could collapse seems very far-fetched to me, because most people attribute that vast improvement over the last 20, 30, 40 years to the government. They give a lot of credit to the government for that. And so like if they hit a rough patch that lasts even 5 years, I don't think it's that brittle. I don't think the system is ready to collapse. I think people have a lot of confidence in the system there based on what happened looking backwards over the last, say, 20 years. And that's another thing I think Westerners don't appreciate.
Yeah, one of my favorite classes from college, I studied computer science and finance and information systems in college, but one of my favorite classes was actually demographics, sociology class. And one of the things I learned was about demographic cohorts. And so, I think that's proven helpful, because if you really think about it, all the old people right now in China, 85% of them were farmers.
Yep.
And that's going to shape the way that they think about, to your point, retirement. It's also going to shape how they feel about how they consume and what they purchase. They're just not going to be going out there and splurging, to your point. They want a house. They want to be around family. They want to take care of their kids. It's very simple. And so I think because I think oftentimes Americans don't understand that background. China, is just such a big place that I think a lot of the problems with understanding China are just people don't have time to break it down to the next level, like break it down by region,
yeah,
or break it down by socioeconomic class, or break it down by blue collar versus white collar. But I think you need to break if you really want to understand China, you can't look at GDP. You have to break it down by sector. You can't look at consumption versus investment. Again, you have to break it down by sector, by industry. So it does require work, and it requires thinking along at a deeper level of a country that's 1.4 billion people. So I think the biggest problem is just people think 99% of people look at China and see it as a monolith. They have one picture, one person, one characterization of China. They can't really go deeper than that, or it's very, very difficult to go deeper.
Let me throw out some sort of two different ways to look at China by numbers. And I'll throw out the numbers that you could quote to make it seem like, wow, this Chinese economy is already qualitatively bigger than the US economy. Whereas another set of figures I could throw out that suggests like, oh, China's still way behind the US. And so you see these dueling kind of worldviews all the time on Twitter, and I see you sometimes engaging in this. So we could say, oh, purchasing power parity adjusted, their economy is already like kind of a third bigger than the United States. And you might say, what context do you care about this? Well, maybe you care about it in terms of how much they can build up their military. Maybe that's the right metric, since the expenditures are domestic that they have to make in order to build up their military. The labor to build a tank or a ship or a missile is local. And so the PPP numbers are right one. And if their PPP total GDP is a lot bigger than the US, then that means they can produce a lot more stuff from military perspective. From the viewpoint of Joe economist, though, if I divide their GDP by the population, the average income is still probably a third or a fourth of, depending on whether you use PPP or exchange rates. Somebody who's an average person in China looks like they're pretty poor by US standards. They're in poverty. And then someone else can come back and say, yeah, but if you look at that person's life, they have an air conditioned apartment, they ride the metro, they have a laptop, they have a cell phone, their cell phone bandwidth is faster than yours. So it becomes extremely tough to make these comparisons. You could also look at, for example, the amount of electricity generated and consumed in countries, and there, like China just dwarfs the United States. So talk a little bit about the difficulty in making these comparisons between the two economies.
Yeah, I mean, my view is that well, first of all, I think in China, I think we have to on a per capita basis. I mean, there's 1.4 billion people, so even if China is, yeah, I think the numbers are China's manufacturing value add is 30%, and the U.S. is 18 or 19%. I think on a per capita basis, the U.S. is still actually manufacturing more in terms of value.
Yep.
But I think adjusting it purely based on the spot exchange rate is also undercounting the amount of production in China. I think so I think that the answer is actually closer to the purchasing power adjusted parity, but even then there's a lot of issues. One of the issues that I've been studying is actually just the way that GDP itself is calculated. I think there's national or global standards on how to calculate GDP, but countries have a lot of leeway to interpret those standards. And there's also older standards and newer standards. And for a long time, China was actually on an older standards. I think the 2008 version of SNA. And so under the older versions, even if there were true economic activity, sometimes it wouldn't be counted. I think services was one of the components of GDP that was revised in the latest accounting update. And China has slowly adopted it, but it's been taking time. And just even more fundamentally, I think China came from a communist history past, and their measurement systems. I mean, we have to sometimes think about. I mean, there's always a lot of questions about the numbers coming out of China, and are they being faked or are they fraudulent? And the way I look at it, I see a bunch of bean counters, and bean counters have their good traits and their bad traits. They sometimes make mistakes. They sometimes count the wrong things. Sometimes the way that GDP is put together involves merging dozens and dozens of different statistical series and triangulating and so I just look at it as this big approximation exercise anyway, and of course I think there's some political or propaganda elements to it, but I think that usually has mainly to do with like the top level numbers. I mean, the average person is not going to care about steel production per capita or anything like that. They're going to compare it with that 5% GDP number. And so I think we've seen some evidence of smoothing, whether it's real world smoothing by, using sort of, stimulus and taking off stimulus, or actual, playing with the GDP deflator, the inflation assumption to make it look smoother than it really is. But, is there wholesale, fraudulent or faking of number? No, I see bean counters, counting up numbers, sometimes imperfectly and often having to revise, and it's really interesting. I've that was one of the things where if you're sort of a China macro tourist, and I think one of the things that you pick up on early is, well, you can't trust the numbers coming out of China. And, I picked up on that theme as well, but, I think for me, my approach was to dig into the numbers, and to look into the numbers. And I think we'll talk about later about where, picking a very specific sector like high-speed rail, a lot of what I learned about, how, Chinese bean counters count things was by looking at the detailed numbers coming out of this one sector and seeing how they triangulated with the financials and how it rolled up into the rest of the economy. And very importantly, how it sometimes was very, very different from what you would hear about, in the West and in media that actually didn't take the time to look at the numbers and try to reconcile them for yourself from a really detailed level. And so this actually I think plays on this idea of going deeper and deeper. And so we started with sort of global, then we talked about China. Then I think you peel back that onion and you get down to a sector, and and I think it's been really just like with my professional career where I started big picture and went down to building companies. in the same way, I think my approach to understanding China has been to form a macro view, but then validate it by going deeper and deeper, and actually getting a much less abstract understanding of the numbers, and actually getting a real, physical or tangible understanding of what those numbers are in the case of high-speed rail.
Yeah, so we're an hour in, so I would just say let's jump into high-speed rail, which is something I know you've analyzed in depth, and it's a huge symbolic thing in China that it's a symbol of like where they're really world leading, both in technology and the scale of deployment. And for, again, like people who've never been to China and ridden on their rail system, it's incredibly impressive when you get on one of these trains. Before we do that, let me just comment that I totally agree with you that starting with this macro view, top line numbers, but then you have to drill down to really get to the reality. I would offer another example, which is the scientific and technological competitiveness of, say, China versus the US. There's the top line numbers like patents, number of college graduates with a certain type of degree, number of innovations in a particular vertical. Those could be misleading. What you really need to do is, and what someone like me who's a professor of physics is in a good position to do, is you really see how good people are. Like you see the Chinese kids who went to Chinese universities and now they're in graduate programs in the US, and they are among the best grad students that we have. No department here could survive without those students across not just physics, but physical sciences and engineering, computer science. But then you go there and you actually talk to the professors who, pretty young now. I mean, they're much younger than I am, the new professors there. And you see, like, is this guy up to speed? Is this guy really at a world-class level in his training and research and what his team is doing in their lab? And the answer is yes. So the basic thing, like, you can have all this debate on the internet, like, oh, these are bullshit patents, these are not useful, or they don't really know what they're doing. Well, you know what? Talk to any professor of engineering or physics or chemistry in the United States who has traveled to China recently and looked at what they're doing there. And they will tell you they pretty much caught up. They might not be exactly caught up. The US might still be ahead, but, largely they've caught up, and it's qualitatively different situation than even 10 years ago. So that's my in-depth report on something that I've seen firsthand. Let's switch over to high-speed rail. So there are two things about it. Like, I often hear the claim that this is just some huge sink of resources in China. It can't really be justified. It's a waste of money. It's all for show. And eventually they're going to run out of money and this whole system's going to collapse. Maybe we can just start with that, and then you can take it wherever you want to go after that.
Yeah, well, let me just preface this by saying I've always just been interested in public infrastructure and trains. When I first moved to Hong Kong, and the first time I stepped into the MTR, I was out. I mean, I was like, oh, my cell phone works, while the train is running, and that was in 2001.
Now
I rode
but now I think, can't you get on the MTR and then like literally like go all the way to Beijing or something? You have to transfer to a train, but then you can go like all the way up to Beijing now, I think, on high speed train or something.
Yeah, well, on the high speed train, but as well, yeah, I think you can take it from. I used to joke that you could get from the Hong Kong airport to my office without ever stepping outside. You could just, get on the train and go on the Airport Express and then take a series of covered steps and go through buildings and eventually get to my office at the Chong Kong Center in downtown Hong Kong. But yeah, and I rode the Shanghai Maglev in 2005. My first experience on the high-speed rail was actually in Taiwan in 2007. And I used to actually keep this little blog. I think it was on Zanga, and I wrote, it was actually one of my first more serious posts. And I posted about how, for the cost of the war on terror, we could have built, at Taiwan rates of, dollars per kilometer, we could have built our own little high speed rail network by now, back in the mid 2000s. But, and so of course, when China started to build, its network, I'll be honest, I was actually pretty skeptical. First of all, I thought China was developing. I didn't think it was developing that fast, that it could actually get it done. And I was frankly very, very skeptical about it. And so when the first lines opened, and again, I the first time I actually wrote it was in 2016. So, when the first lines open in 2007, 2008, you hear about it, but it doesn't really register with you. And then when the crash happened in 2011, I think that was, there was this theme that you touched upon about how China has this investment heavy model, and that high-speed rail was just another part of that, another example, if not the most egregious example of that over-investment model. And I think that narrative was also tied to some of these earlier themes that we talked about, like how the state or state-owned companies are can't compete with private sector companies on allocating capital. So I think that sort of perpetuated or propagated into this idea that, of course, high-speed rail must be inefficient. They're spending hundreds of billions of dollars. There's no process in place. They're shooting in the dark. And frankly, I think that was how I felt about it as well for the first few years. I was open, though. I had an open mind that, hey, maybe the Chinese could actually get this right. And I was open, and I saw the merits in it. China is, again, it's a country that can't put a car in every person's driveway, or actually everybody doesn't have a driveway, put a car in. And so they have to rely on public transportation more. I understood the positive social externalities of rail. We didn't have to, burn gasoline, less pollution, and just not being stuck in traffic and being congested. But what I really didn't understand for a long time was actually a way to think about the numbers of high-speed rail. And so, I started kind of borrowing from my investment experience, started just drilling down into the numbers. And so it turns out China Railway, which owns or controls the entire passenger network as well as the freight network, is one of the largest bond issuers, if not the largest bond issuer public bond issuer in China, which means that they have public financials. Now, this happened because the Ministry of Transport, it used to be part of the Ministry of Transport. It was the last major ministry to corporatize. This followed the Wenzhou crash, as well as the corruption allegations in the early 2010s. And they created China Railway out of this. They listed and financed it mostly with bonds and at the project level secured loans from the banks. And what that meant was, starting in 2013, China Railway started publicly issuing numbers that you could actually start tracking. Now, I didn't realize this until actually several years later. But you started seeing some numbers come out. And I think this is where a little bit of, having a financial background helps. So being able to read like an income statement and a balance sheet, and when you're debating things like debt and thinking about things like credit capacity, it helps to understand financials. The other thing is, all these numbers are Chinese. So, you can get it translated, but like nobody who has a passing interest in high-speed rail and doesn't speak Chinese is going to translate it. So, I ended up, going through the Chinese language financials and also the operating data that they received. And slowly this picture began to emerge. That was a little bit different, I think, from the more popular narrative at the time, which was that it was highly inefficient. They had built routes in places where people didn't live. And so, ridership was very, very low, which is, the worst thing that you can do for high upfront fixed cost projects is, having low utilization. There was this idea that it was debt funded investment that was done because, the politicians wanted GDP growth and not because there were actually real reasons for it. And by digging into the numbers, I slowly peeled that onion and, realized that a lot of these things weren't actually true. Number one, ridership and utilization was actually not that bad, even in the early years. It actually bottomed out around 2015 and 2016 after the first phase lines had basically just after the second phase construction lines had opened, and then it started to slowly improve in 2017 to 2019. I looked at the debt numbers, I looked at the income statement, and I realized that actually, the company could support the debt load based on not only the ticket revenue. So a lot of people were just looking at the ticket revenue. They didn't understand that part of the real model, and you would understand this if you had looked at like MTR Corporation in Hong Kong. Part of the real model is that you generate all this foot traffic, and that's really a real estate play. So actually, you have to look at it as a combination of a transportation network, but also a real estate play. So all the commercial leases that they rent out to catering and restaurants at the train stations, the catering on the trains, the advertisements on the train. This is all part of that economic model. People weren't. There's a famous Chinese economist who was critical of high-speed rail, and part of his analysis did not take into account the sort of real estate business portion of China Rail.
Yeah. Now, sorry to interrupt, but just a point for Americans, maybe Europeans would understand this better, but if you're in Taiwan or Hong Kong or Korea or Japan or China, some of the most valuable real estate is where there's a metro station or a high-speed rail station, because there's guaranteed flow of people there. And sometimes you'll see the most luxurious, beautiful malls, apartment complexes, office buildings just built around that structure. Actually, even in Bangkok now, you see that. So that's something to take into account, because the rail company is creating that value by putting the station there. So that's part of the investment. And then that creates this complex, which then turns out to be super valuable in real estate terms.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you can't really run a profitable, public transportation business without thinking about retail and monetizing all of that foot traffic that you generate. Some of the best business models are actually hidden real estate businesses, like Asian food markets. They don't make money on the food. They make money by renting out all the stores based on the traffic that they generate. So, I mean, I think you need to understand the business model of transport. And then I think, secondly, I think the other piece was just all the stuff that's not measured, the positive externalities. I mean, these have real value, but it's hard to measure. And I think this is where this discussion of whether a private sector approach versus a public sector approach becomes really, really interesting, because, the private sector approach would be to effectively align the project sponsor as an equity holder. But if you think about public transport, it's not just about the equity owners. It's about the travelers. It's about the local communities and sort of the spillover effects. If you're an equity holder, your incentive is going to be to maximize ticket prices to some optimal level that may not be actually optimal for society. Whereas I think China Railway, being a state-owned enterprise, they actually don't try to optimize for return on equity. They actually try to keep prices low.
Yeah, it's ridiculously,
so
it's ridiculously cheap to ride the system, at least from a Western perspective.
And actually increasingly from a Chinese perspective. So, one of the things you'll notice with high-speed rail tickets is that prices don't really go up. So when the Beijing Tianjin line opened in 2009, I think it was 58 yuan to take that 1 hour or 45-minute trip. It's still actually, I think some fares I saw were still actually cheaper than that, even though inflation or just the fact that household incomes have risen 3 to 4x since 2009. So it's become 3 to 4 times more affordable to take that ride. And that's may not be something that happens if this were, if the decision makers, the people making decisions on tariffs, were the equity holder.
At this stage, though, when you're talking about the externalities, social benefits from the transportation infrastructure to average people, it gets pretty complicated. Like in the U.S., we built out the freeway system after World War II and spent unbelievable amounts of money on that. And some environmentalists would say, to the detriment of our cities and, all this stuff, walkability, all that stuff. But of course, it's an incredibly complex question. Like, was it worth it? Was that a good thing to build all these freeways? Of course, it had very strong second order effects on economic development of the whole country, right? So I think for me, very tough to really just get the whole thing. Like, I don't even know, what's my opinion about all the freeway building we did in the US? Is it like net good or net bad? I'm not even sure. But from a narrow perspective though, I think you're saying that the rail system, say the high-speed rail system in China, is not going to need huge continued government subsidies forever, will it? What do the numbers say about that?
Well, to grow the network, the company still has to, take on debt to build out new assets. But the existing network is largely self-sufficient at this point. Okay. Like I said, they're not maximizing revenue. They could actually increase tariffs and probably grow revenue, but they actually don't try to maximize revenue. They basically target paying off all the debt that they've issued to support the network at like 3 to 4% interest rate. Yep. And they set tariffs at that level, and that's it. So they're not looking to generate actually a return on equity. I think the return on equity for them is basically the consumer surplus and all these positive externalities that accrue to other sectors and other into the households in the form of higher quality of life.
For the existing networks, ignoring like building it out further, but for the existing network, future maintenance and keeping the technology up to date, does that look like it's going to be like a problem where they'll have to get a chunk of cash from government to do that? Or
no, I mean, the maintenance costs are well understood. There was this really great World Bank report. World Bank financed 4 of the phase 1 lines back from 2008 to 2014. So they had deep insight into how these projects were run. And by the way, that gave me a lot of confidence that because you had a sort of external independent party looking at these projects, that that gave me a lot of confidence that the numbers weren't being made up, right? Because they have access to all the detail project implement. They were a lender to some of these projects. But the World Bank came out with a report that summarized their findings about China's high-speed rail experience in 2019, and they talk about maintenance. One of the many things they talk about is that maintenance costs are well understood. I think for every kilometer of rail, it costs, I think, something like between 1.8 to 2.3 million RMB per year to just maintain the line so that it stays in tip-top shape. So those costs are built into the cost recovery structure, into the operating expense structure that they use to set tariffs. Those costs don't necessarily, they don't go up. They go up probably with the cost of labor. Mm-hmm. Though, you can also argue, I think they've automated a lot of the maintenance by they've created all this, and this is another really interesting thing. They created all this specialized equipment that was geared towards high-speed rail, that was specialized for high-speed rail. You've seen this happen in a bunch of other industries as well. That's unique to that sector. So they have automated maintenance equipment that will run along the line, make sure that there's, it's smooth and that the metal isn't worn out. And they're now talking about using big data and machine learning. And I'm not sure if it's really AI, but they're using big data to really understand, preemptively how you can maintain these lines. So those costs are all built into the OpEx structure and covered by tariffs and by this ancillary non-transport revenue.
So just to summarize it, I think you're saying that having looked into the details, there's enough transparency that you can conclude that this is actually a healthy system. It's not what was the word? Not pink, not white elephant, but gray rhino. Or there's some there were some negative ways that people had to refer to this whole thing as just like a huge sink of resources for the Chinese government and people. But I think you're confident that's actually not the case.
Yeah, and what really validated for me, Steve, was during the pandemic when people weren't traveling, the financials didn't look great. They were basically running at a loss. Knowing that eventually they would come out of the pandemic. But what really validated for me was you saw a lot of momentum going from 2016 to 2019 in sort of the increase in ridership. And then you sort of had this dip. What validated for me was coming out of the pandemic, ridership shot back up to, it's not quite on trend yet, but it's back up to, I think 92 or 93% of what would have been the trend without the pandemic. And, you're talking, China Railway is a company that is generating something like $200 billion of revenue and $70 billion of EBITDA. These are, so it's sort of, there's this cognitive dissonance when I hear about this thing being a disaster, like a financial disaster, when I see numbers like that, in the financials that millions of public bond investors rely on to get their dividend payments or their interest payment.
That's great. That's a great story, Ed. And we'll put some links into your analysis is available not just on Twitter, but it's on is it on a blog or somewhere that people can find?
On Substack, yeah.
Okay, put some links into that. We've been on for almost an hour, 20 minutes. I thought maybe we could close out by just talking about let me throw out a hypothesis and then you can give me your reaction to it. So my view of the problems that they're having in the Chinese economy right now, one could think of multiple drivers. So one is maybe Xi imposing some increased centralization and less business-friendly environment on what's happening in China. Number two is still coming out of COVID to some extent. And number three is, to me, maybe the most important one, a property bubble that everybody has known about for 10 years or more. They knew they were going to have to pop it. The government moved to pop it and is deliberately shifting investment so that growth in their economy is not coming from investment mainly in property and related infrastructure, but in investment in advanced technology and advanced manufacturing. And that, to me, if that third thing is the dominant component of the malaise that they're feeling right now, it's a gamble because maybe it's not going to work out. But on the other hand, it's a very clear strategy that they have, that they're going to endure whatever it is, 5 years or maybe even 10 years to get out of this property bubble problem that they had. But at the end of it, maybe they'll be even higher on the value add chain in manufacturing and high technology. Maybe you can just react to what I just said.
Yeah, no. And so just, I think that, having watched and participated in looking at the Chinese economy over the last 20 years or more, I've seen the economy actually go through multiple shifts, driven by some of the factors that we talked about before, like demographic change and just the natural process of moving up and climbing the value chain in terms of knowledge and skills and human capital. So to me, the property and infrastructure investment of, really in the sort of starting in the early 2000s when they reformed property reform and you could actually own a home for the first time. And then really accelerating after the GFC. To me, property and infrastructure were necessary evils because this is pretty low on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like you need shelter. Yep. And you need a place to live, especially in a country of 1.4 billion and where there's not a lot of land. And so you're going to have to build up. There's just no way of escaping that. So I'm actually, I think on the more, optimistic side that it wasn't actually as big of a bubble as people thought. I think there was definitely some malinvestment, but I think that the issue of malinvestment was more one of distribution, not one of aggregate malinvestment. I think if you understand the way that the land finance mechanism work, it's sort of like it's like a one size fits all financing approach that may work well in Shanghai, but doesn't work well in Guizhou. So you end up with certain areas like the tier 1 cities where there's actually an undersupply of housing because they're dealing with they don't want too many people to move there because they have to provide social services. And then you have other places like in Guizhou where there's actually an oversupply of housing because you have this crude financing mechanism. So to me, it was actually more of a distribution problem because to your earlier point, I think the central government plays that disciplining role. And they're the ones who stepped in and said, okay, I think it's in aggregate, we're getting a little bit too we're building a little bit too much, and we have to start deflating that bubble. And it was actually like a 10-year process of trying to deflate that bubble. And so that transition to me didn't start 3 years ago. It started 10 years ago. And sort of laying the groundwork. I mean, this is one of the challenges of dealing with an economy of 1.4 billion people, is that you can't move the ship that quickly, especially something as big as this. So, it's actually, I think the degree of difficulty is quite high. And so you're never going to get everything right. I think there's also the other, I think, big picture issue in China of just rising inequality. So 12 years ago, 15 years ago, if you talked to people, that was one of the biggest issues on people's minds. They're like, well, the economy is growing fast and it's dynamic and everything, but you're leaving the inland provinces behind. You've got 3 major regions that are prospering. The rest of the country is being left behind. Social inequality, which was absolutely a valid issue back 15 years ago, it takes sacrifice to correct social inequality. And I think a lot of the slowdown in growth, I mean, I would even argue that a lot of the infrastructure investment that was sort of spread out peanut butter style across the country was one of the ways that they were actually trying to address poverty, is by bringing infrastructure into regions that couldn't afford it on their own, which meant, the wealthier regions are effectively subsidizing asset and infrastructure development for the poor regions. That to me is a social inequality balancing effect. And so I think the cost of that has been slower growth. So I call property and infrastructure a necessary evil because it's fundamentally a very low return on investment type of activity, but it's also really necessary. You need homes and you need infrastructure. So now, one of the issues with turning around this big ship of 1.4 billion souls is you had to make some sacrifices. And I think the government made a conscious choice to have the mass affluent in society eat a lot of the pain. Over the last 3 years, they cracked down on property, which, the people buying second and third homes for speculation were all in that upper 5 to 10%. So they're the ones who are really hurt by, speculating and by real estate prices going down. Whereas everybody else who bought a home, I mean, they're living in it. It's their one home. For them, it doesn't really matter what the mark to market is. It's just where they live. So that was one. Secondly, I think they've made a conscious effort to make sure that particularly the blue collar labor force is fully employed. I think in China, the key stimulus, it's not like a Western style demand side stimulus where you're just cutting checks to people. I think their form of stimulus is to make sure people are employed and earning incomes that are growing. And out of that income, they're going to spend more and more and more, and with, result in rising demand. So I think they've been very focused on making sure that the blue collar labor pool and the farmers and, in the countryside, that their incomes are rising. And so that combined group has actually been has done relatively well over the last 10 years in terms of their income. Whereas the sort of the mass affluent, they've gotten hit on the capital income side with stocks and with real estate, and their incomes are actually, I think, rising a little bit below the national average as well. So I think they were the casualty in all this. And so what we're seeing right now, I think the big question is whether, people talk about this economic malaise. It's largely with that top 5 to 10% of the population. And I think the bet is that at some point they're going to accept, their losses, and, they're going to open up their pocketbooks. It's not like their income has been going down. They're just not rising as quickly as they were before. So I think there's been a reset of expectations for the sort of the mass affluent. We've seen that's fairly evident. A lot of the people in my circle, that's who I talk to. And I sometimes have to consciously tell myself, this is not all of China. This is the top 5 to 10% of China. So this is not necessarily indicative. So I think that is the challenge, but that's sort of a wait and see game. You can't control consumer sentiment. It's one of the things that the Chinese government cannot control. They tend to just try to stick to, in terms of policy, things that they can control, and for things that they cannot control, they'll make sure that they have policy tools available so that if consumer sentiment declines even further, can they make up for it with some stimulus? So I think that's how. We haven't seen a lot of stimulus yet, because, and that to me is actually a sign that things are actually going okay, maybe not gangbusters, but that if things do fall off, and either if there's an exogenous, if there's another round of 60% tariffs, there's an adjustment mechanism there, probably with the FX rate, or if consumer sentiment improves, well, then you can maybe adjust the other way. So to me, it's sort of a Goldilocks environment, and we're going through a transition phase now, to the point of these resources flowing formerly from the property sector and from sort of old infrastructure into some of the new infrastructure stuff like clean energy, as well as the advanced manufacturing side. And that just takes time. I've been studying a lot. I've been doing a lot of recently on just understanding like the electric vehicle, industry and capacity. It takes time to build up capacity. I think in my latest research, I sort of have a different view from the mainstream, which is I think China is not suffering from EV overcapacity. In fact, I think they need to grow EV capacity by 5x over the next 15 years. And growing at 5x means installing the equivalent of South Korea's auto manufacturing output every single year from now till 2033. So it's not a trivial task. I think it doesn't happen like magically. You can't press a button and it happens. You need to have the people in place. Yep. You need to have the skills. You need to coordinate the entire supply chain. So there's a lot to do. I think for the economy, there's plenty of stuff to keep it occupied for the next 10 years. But the transition is happening, and I think we just need to watch how things go.